I'm Daisy, 52 years old, and I was standing frozen in my daughter-in-law Melissa's living room doorway, suitcase in hand, as she coldly stated, "You're not welcome here anymore. Find somewhere else to stay." After driving 12 hours to help with my newborn grandson, this rejection cut deep. My son Brian stood silent beside his wife. As I turned to leave, fighting tears, I bumped into a distinguished man in an expensive suit at the front door who asked, "Mrs. Daisy Morrison, we need to talk about your inheritance." Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. If you've ever felt the sting of family betrayal or wondered how karma really works, this story will resonate with you. Please hit that like button and subscribe to hear how one cruel rejection led to the most unexpected twist of my life. Trust me, what happened next will leave you speechless. 3 days before that devastating moment, my phone rang at 11 at night. It was Brian, my only son, and his voice cracked with exhaustion. "Mom, please, we need you. The baby won't stop crying, Melissa hasn't slept in days, and I don't know what to do anymore." My heart melted instantly. Baby James had arrived 2 weeks early, and they were struggling. Without hesitation, I told him I'd be there by tomorrow evening. I immediately called my supervisor at the elementary school where I'd worked as a librarian for 23 years. She understood completely and approved my emergency family leave. I spent the rest of the night packing, my mind racing with excitement about finally meeting my first grandchild. I'd waited so long for this moment, respecting Brian and Melissa's request for space during the pregnancy, though it had nearly killed me to stay away. The 12-hour drive from Ohio to North Carolina felt endless. I stopped only for gas and coffee, my car loaded with gifts I'd been collecting for months. A hand-knitted blanket I'd spent 3 months creating, classic children's books I'd been saving, and yes, perhaps too many tiny outfits. But how could a grandmother resist? When I finally pulled into their driveway at 7 that evening, my back ached and my eyes burned from the long drive, but joy overrode any discomfort. Brian met me at the door, and I barely recognized my son. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, his usually neat appearance disheveled, but his smile when he saw me was genuine. "Thank God you're here, Mom," he whispered, pulling me into a tight hug. Then I heard it, the thin wail of a baby from somewhere deeper in the house, and my grandmother's heart practically burst. But Melissa's greeting chilled my excitement instantly. She stood in the hallway, holding James, and her expression could have frozen fire. "Hello, Daisy," she said, not Mom or Mother like she used to call me. "Just Daisy," cold and formal. "Brian shouldn't have bothered you. We're managing fine." I tried to ignore the slight, focusing instead on the tiny bundle in her arms. "May I hold him?" I asked softly, my arms already reaching out. Melissa's hesitation lasted just long enough to sting before she reluctantly passed James to me. The moment his tiny weight settled into my arms, everything else faded away. He was perfect, absolutely perfect, with Brian's nose and what looked like my father's chin. "You're holding him wrong," Melissa snapped within 30 seconds. "Support his head more." "No, not like that. Here, just give him back." She practically snatched him from my arms, and I saw Brian wince but say nothing. That set the tone for everything that followed. That first night, every single thing I did drew criticism. I heated the bottle 2 degrees too warm, though I'd used the exact thermometer she had. I folded the burp cloths wrong, apparently there was a specific way they needed to be creased. When I offered to take the night shift so they could sleep, Melissa informed me that I'd only confused James with my different energy. I bit my tongue and retreated to the guest room, telling myself she was just exhausted and overwhelmed. The next morning, I woke early and prepared breakfast, hoping to smooth things over. I made Brian's favorite blueberry pancakes, fresh fruit salad, and even managed to find Melissa's preferred green tea. But when they came downstairs, Melissa took one look at the spread and said, "We don't eat processed flour anymore. And those blueberries aren't organic." She made herself a smoothie and left the room, leaving Brian to awkwardly pick at a pancake while avoiding my eyes. That afternoon, while Melissa napped, I finally got some time alone with James. Brian had run to the pharmacy, trusting me to watch the baby. I settled into the rocking chair, James cradled against my chest, and began singing the same lullabies I'd sung to Brian 30 years ago. My grandmother had sung them to me, and her mother before that. It was a family tradition spanning generations, and sharing it with James felt sacred. "What are you doing?" Melissa's sharp voice cut through the gentle melody. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, fury radiating from every line of her body. "Those old songs will confuse him. We're using the peaceful baby sleep system, and it specifically says to avoid unpredictable auditory stimulation." I stopped mid-verse, confused and hurt. "They're just lullabies, Melissa. Family songs that have been passed down." "Exactly," she interrupted. "Your family's ways. But this is my family now, and we do things based on science, not outdated traditions." She took James from me again, and I noticed she'd been doing that constantly, swooping in to remove him from my arms at every opportunity. Things deteriorated further when Melissa's parents arrived the next day. The contrast in how they were treated made my stomach churn. Richard and Caroline Williams swept in like visiting royalty, immediately given the master bedroom while Melissa gushed over their arrival. They'd brought a $10,000 stroller system and were treated to Melissa's brightest smiles and warmest hospitality. Meanwhile, I was relegated to fetching things and staying out of the way. During dinner, Caroline made pointed comments about some grandparents not respecting boundaries while looking directly at me. Richard pontificated about how children need consistency, not confusing influences from too many authority figures. I watched Brian shrink further into himself with each passive-aggressive attack, never once defending me or even meeting my eyes. The final straw came that evening. I'd gone to check on James and found him fussing in his crib. Instinctively, I picked him up and began gently rocking him, humming quietly. He settled almost immediately, his tiny fist clutching my finger. For just a moment, peace descended, and I felt the pure joy of comforting my grandchild. "Put him down immediately." Melissa's screech made James startle and begin crying again. "You're ruining his sleep training. This is exactly why I didn't want you here. You can't respect simple boundaries. You're undermining everything we're trying to establish as parents." Brian appeared behind her, and for one moment, I thought he'd finally stand up for me. Instead, he put his hand on Melissa's shoulder and said quietly, "Maybe it would be best if Mom left tomorrow. This is obviously too stressful for everyone." The betrayal hit harder than any physical blow could have. My own son, the baby I'd raised alone after his father left, the child I'd sacrificed everything for, was choosing her cruelty over his mother's love. I placed James gently back in his crib, straightened my spine, and nodded once. "I'll pack tonight," I said with as much dignity as I could muster. The next morning came too quickly. I'd barely slept, alternating between tears and anger, replaying every moment and wondering what I'd done wrong. How had the sweet girl Brian dated in college turned into this cold, calculating woman? When had my son become too weak to stand up for what was right? I zipped my suitcase closed as dawn broke through the guest room curtains, my gifts for James still wrapped and unwanted in the corner. I dragged my luggage downstairs, hoping to slip out quietly and salvage what remained of my dignity. But Melissa was waiting in the living room, still in her silk pajamas, looking perfectly put together despite the early hour. Brian stood beside her, unable to meet my eyes, shifting his weight like he had as a guilty child. "I want to be clear," Melissa began, her voice crisp and businesslike, "this isn't personal, Daisy. But Brian and I need to establish ourselves as parents without interference. Your presence here is confusing for James and disruptive to our routine. It's best if you leave now and perhaps we can revisit visits when James is older. Maybe his first birthday. A year. She was banning me from my grandson's life for a year. I opened my mouth to protest, to beg, to rage at the unfairness, but Brian finally looked at me. The pleading in his eyes, the exhaustion, the defeat, it all told me fighting would only make things worse for him. So I simply nodded, picked up my suitcase, and walked toward the door. That's when I collided with the man in the expensive suit. He was tall, probably mid-60s, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Everything about him screamed money and authority, from his perfectly tailored charcoal suit to his Italian leather shoes. "Pardon me," I mumbled, trying to step around him. "Mrs. Daisy Morrison?" His voice was cultured, professional. "I apologize for the early hour, but I've been trying to reach you for several days. I'm Charles Wellington from Wellington, Ashford, and Associates. We need to discuss your inheritance from Martha Harrison." The name stopped me cold. Aunt Martha. I hadn't heard from her in 20 years, not since a family feud had split us all apart. Martha's dead? The words came out as a whisper. Behind me, I heard Melissa's sharp intake of breath. Charles Wellington nodded solemnly. She passed 2 weeks ago. I've been executor of her estate for many years. She left very specific instructions regarding her assets, and you, Mrs. Morrison, are the primary beneficiary. That's impossible, I said, still reeling. Martha has children, grandchildren. We haven't spoken in decades. Nevertheless, Charles continued, pulling out an envelope, she left her entire estate to you. The house in Asheville, her investment portfolio, the art collection, and controlling interest in Harrison Industries. The total value is approximately $3.8 million. The silence that followed could have been cut with a knife. I felt my knees go weak and reached out to steady myself against the doorframe. 3.8 million. The number didn't even seem real. Behind me, Melissa made a strange choking sound. Daisy, wait, Melissa's voice had transformed completely, now dripping with honey. Let's not be hasty. Why don't you come back inside? We can talk about this. I'll make coffee, we can have a proper breakfast. Brian, help your mother with her suitcase. I turned slowly, seeing the naked greed in her eyes, the calculating way she was already reassessing my value. Brian looked stunned, his mouth hanging open slightly. I felt a cold clarity settle over me. No thank you, I said calmly. You made yourself quite clear. I'm leaving now. I turned to Charles. Mr. Wellington, might we continue this conversation elsewhere? Of course. My office is downtown. I can drive you if you'd like to leave your car here. My car is fine, I said firmly. I'll follow you. As I loaded my suitcase into my 10-year-old Honda, I could hear Melissa's voice rising inside the house, shrill and demanding. Brian appeared at the door, looking lost. Mom, please, let's discuss this. Melissa didn't mean. Yes, she did, I cut him off. And you let her. You stood there and let her treat me like garbage, Brian. Your choice is made. Now I need to go handle this situation. The drive to Charles Wellington's office gave me time to process the shock. Martha and I had been close once, before her children convinced her that my mother had stolen family jewelry. It was all lies, of course, but Martha believed them and cut us off completely. Why would she leave me everything now? Charles's office occupied the top floor of a gleaming downtown high-rise. Everything about it whispered old money and discretion. His assistant brought tea in delicate china cups as we settled into leather chairs across from his massive mahogany desk. Martha came to me 5 years ago, Charles began, opening a thick folder. She'd discovered the truth about the jewelry incident and was devastated by how she'd treated your family. She hired private investigators to learn about your life, your character. What she found impressed her greatly. He slid a letter across the desk. Martha's spidery handwriting covered several pages. My hands shook as I began to read. My dearest Daisy, it began, by the time you read this, I'll be gone, and perhaps that's for the best. I lack the courage to face you after what I've done. The truth about the jewelry came out when my son Richard drunkenly confessed he'd sold it to cover gambling debts and blamed your mother. By then, 20 years had passed, your mother was gone, and I was too proud and ashamed to reach out. The letter went on, detailing how she'd watched from afar as I raised Brian alone, worked multiple jobs to put him through college, and never spoke badly of her despite everything. She wrote about her own children's greed, their constant demands for money, their threats when she tried to cut them off. But the final decision, the letter continued, came when I learned about Melissa. Yes, my dear, she's my granddaughter, Caroline's girl. I know exactly what she is, a manipulative gold digger who's already burned through 2 husbands' families. When I discovered she'd set her sights on your Brian specifically because she knew you were in my will as a contingency, I knew what I had to do. I had to read that paragraph 3 times before it sank in. Melissa was Martha's granddaughter. She'd married Brian to get to me, to get to money she thought I might inherit. The calculating evil of it took my breath away. There's more, Charles said gently. Martha documented everything. Melissa's previous marriages, her schemes, the way she targeted Brian. It's all here, along with evidence of Richard and Caroline's financial crimes against Martha's company. She wanted you to have everything you need to protect yourself. They'll fight this, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Charles smiled then, a shark's smile. They'll try. But Martha was very thorough. Video depositions, psychiatric evaluations proving her sound mind, documentation of every threat and manipulation. She spent 2 years making this ironclad. They don't have a chance. My phone buzzed constantly as Charles explained the details of the estate. Texts from Brian, missed calls from Melissa, even suddenly friendly messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. The news was already spreading. What should I do first? I asked, feeling overwhelmed. First, get a hotel room. A nice one, you can afford it now. Then, let me handle the legal matters while you decide how you want to proceed. Martha's house in Asheville is empty and waiting whenever you're ready. And Daisy? He leaned forward, his expression serious. Be very careful. Martha's family won't take this quietly. You're going to need security, and you're going to need to be smart about who you trust. As I left his office with a folder full of documents and a black credit card linked to an account with more money than I'd ever dreamed of, I felt the surreal nature of it all. This morning I'd been a rejected grandmother, banned from my grandchild's life. Now I was a millionaire with enemies I didn't even know I had. My phone rang again. Brian. This time, I answered. Mom, Melissa wants to apologize. She's so sorry. She didn't mean any of it. Please come back so we can talk. I almost laughed at the desperation in his voice. Brian, did you know Melissa is Martha's granddaughter? The silence on the other end told me everything. He hadn't known. My poor, foolish son had been played just as much as I had. We need to talk, he said finally, his voice small. Please, Mom, I think I've made a terrible mistake. I checked into the Grand Bohemian Hotel downtown, a luxury I never would have considered before. The suite was larger than my entire apartment back home, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. As I set my phone on the marble counter, it vibrated again. 37 missed calls, 89 text messages, and the number kept climbing. I'd become very popular very suddenly. Brian arrived within an hour, and I almost didn't let him up. But beneath my anger lay 28 years of motherhood, and he was still my son, however disappointing his recent choices. When I opened the door, he looked destroyed. His eyes were red-rimmed, his clothes disheveled in a way that had nothing to do with new parent exhaustion and everything to do with a marriage imploding. She locked me out, he said without preamble. The moment you left, she started making calls. I heard her talking to her mother about contesting the will, about their birthright. When I confronted her about being related to Martha, she laughed. Actually laughed and said I was even more gullible than she'd thought. I let him in but didn't offer comfort. Not yet. How long have you known about the connection to Martha? I swear I didn't know. Brian collapsed onto the sofa, head in his hands. I mean, I knew her family had money, but she said they were in tech. She told me her maiden name was Williams. It wasn't until today that I realized Williams was her stepfather's name. Her real last name is Harrison. The scope of the deception was breathtaking. She targeted you specifically because of me? Mom, she had everything planned. We didn't meet by accident at that coffee shop. She knew where I worked, my routine, what I liked. She played me perfectly, and I was too stupid and lonely to see it. My phone rang. Unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. You conniving witch. The male voice was loud enough that Brian could hear it. You manipulated my mother into cutting us out. That money belongs to the family, not some distant nobody who hasn't spoken to her in decades. Richard, I presume? I kept my voice level despite my racing heart. I'm sorry for your loss. Don't play games with me. You have 48 hours to sign those assets back over to the rightful heirs, or things will get very unpleasant for you. I know where you work, where you live. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Are you threatening me, Richard? Because I'm recording this call, and I'm sure the police would be very interested in hearing it. He hung up immediately. I hadn't been recording, but he didn't need to know that. Brian stared at me with something like awe. Mom, when did you become so tough? Probably around the time my son let his wife throw me out of their house, I replied coolly. His flinch was satisfying, but I took no real pleasure in it. Brian, you need to leave now. I have a lot to process, and frankly, I don't trust you not to report back to Melissa. I wouldn't. Mom, please. She's the one who lied to me. She used me to get to you. I'm a victim here too. No, I said firmly. A victim doesn't have choices. You chose her over me. You chose to stay silent while she humiliated me. You chose to ask me to leave rather than stand up for what was right. Those were choices, Brian, not victimhood. After he left, the attacks intensified. By evening, I'd received 3 more threatening calls, dozens of texts ranging from pleading to menacing, and even a visit from Caroline Williams Harrison herself. She'd somehow discovered my hotel and appeared at my door looking every inch the society matron she was. "May I come in?" she asked with icy politeness. "No," I said simply, keeping the door partially closed. Her mask slipped for just a moment, revealing pure hatred, before she recovered. "Daisy, we're family now, whether we like it or not. My daughter is married to your son. We share a grandchild. Surely we can come to some arrangement. Your daughter deceived my son to access money she believed I'd inherit. That's not family, Caroline. That's a con game. How dare you?" The mask dropped completely now. Melissa loved Brian. The fact that it might help heal the family rift was just a bonus. "Mother had no right to leave everything to you. You abandoned her." "She abandoned us," I corrected. "Based on lies your brother told. And now I understand why. Martha saw what you all really were." Caroline's face turned an alarming shade of purple. "You'll regret this. I'll destroy you. By the time I'm done, you won't be able to show your face anywhere. I have connections you can't imagine." She wasn't bluffing. By the next morning, the attacks had escalated beyond phone calls. Charles called me early, his voice grim. "Someone contacted your employer claiming you've been embezzling from the school library fund." "It's nonsense, of course, but they'll have to investigate." Then came the email from my supervisor, very apologetic but explaining I couldn't return to work until the matter was resolved. 23 years of spotless service undone by one malicious phone call. I'd barely processed that when building security called to inform me my car had been vandalized in the hotel parking garage. "Thief" was spray painted across the windshield in violent red letters. Charles had warned me to be careful, but I hadn't expected the violence of their reaction. These people had grown up with wealth, felt entitled to it in a way I couldn't understand. Having it stolen by someone they considered beneath them was clearly intolerable. The local newspaper situation was even worse. Someone, probably Richard based on the details included, had fed them a story about elder abuse. According to the article that ran online that afternoon, I'd been secretly visiting Martha for years, manipulating a vulnerable old woman into changing her will. It was completely fabricated, but several people had already shared it on social media with disgusted comments about greedy relatives preying on the elderly. "We need to go on offense," Charles said during an emergency meeting. "I've hired a security team for you and a PR firm to handle the media situation. But Daisy, this is going to get worse before it gets better. Are you prepared for that?" Was I? This morning I'd been a grandmother bearing gifts and love. Now I was public enemy number 1 to a family I'd barely known existed. But something had hardened in me when Melissa showed her true face, when Brian chose complicity over courage. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them one. "I'm prepared," I told Charles. "What do we do first?" "First, we move you somewhere more secure. I've arranged a house, very private, with excellent security. Then, we start documenting everything. Every threat, every lie, every attack." Martha was right about one thing. These people are their own worst enemies. Give them enough rope, and they'll hang themselves. That evening, as I settled into the safe house, a fortress-like estate in a gated community, my phone rang with a number I recognized. "Helen, my sister." "Daisy, I just heard. 3.8 million? My God, why didn't you tell me?" I closed my eyes, already knowing where this was going. Helen and I had a complicated relationship, made worse by her perpetual financial troubles and expectation that I'd always bail her out. "It just happened, Helen. I'm still processing it myself." "Well, family should stick together in times like these," she said, her voice taking on that wheedling tone I knew too well. "I could come stay with you, help you deal with all this stress. And you know, Tom just lost his job again, and the kids' tuition is due." "Helen, I can't talk about this right now. I'll call you later." "Daisy, wait. I'm just saying, after everything I've done for you." I hung up. Everything she'd done for me? She'd borrowed $17,000 over the years and never paid back a cent. She'd missed my wedding because of a can't-miss vacation opportunity and had shown up to our mother's funeral 3 hours late and drunk. But now that I had money, suddenly we were close sisters again. The security team Charles hired turned out to be necessary. That night, cameras caught Richard Harrison trying to break into my car again, this time with what looked like a tracking device. The police were called, charges were filed, and by dawn, the real war had begun. The courthouse in downtown Asheville was an imposing structure, all marble columns and solemn authority. 6 weeks had passed since that morning in Melissa's living room, 6 weeks of relentless attacks, legal maneuvering, and shocking revelations. Now, finally, we were here for the hearing that would determine whether Martha's will would stand. Charles had assembled a formidable legal team. Besides himself, we had 2 estate law specialists, a forensic accountant, and a private investigator whose findings had been devastating to the Harrison family's case. I sat between Charles and his associate Jennifer Marks, trying to project confidence I didn't entirely feel. Across the aisle, the Harrison clan had gathered in force. Richard, still out on bail from his attempted breaking and entering charge, sat with his wife Linda, both radiating hostility. Caroline perched beside them, designer suit impeccable, shooting poisonous glances my way. Behind them sat various cousins and relatives I'd never met, all here to support the claim that I'd somehow manipulated Martha into disinheriting her rightful heirs. But it was Melissa's presence that shocked me most. 7 months pregnant now, she'd positioned herself prominently, one hand resting on her belly in a calculated gesture designed to garner sympathy. Brian sat as far from her as the courtroom arrangement allowed, looking miserable. Their divorce proceedings had begun, but she was fighting him on everything, using their son and unborn child as weapons. Judge Patricia Thornton, a stern woman in her 60s, called the court to order. We're here to determine the validity of Martha Harrison's last will and testament, dated 18 months ago. The plaintiffs claim undue influence and diminished capacity. Mr. Wellington, you may present your defense. Charles rose smoothly. Your Honor, we will demonstrate through clear evidence that Martha Harrison was of completely sound mind when she made her final wishes known, and that her decision to leave her estate to Daisy Morrison was based on careful consideration and documented reasoning. He began with the video depositions. Martha appeared on the courtroom screen, frail but sharp-eyed, her voice clear and deliberate. I am making this recording of my own free will, in the presence of my physician, Dr. James Crawford, and my attorney, Charles Wellington. I want to explain why I'm leaving my estate to my niece, Daisy Morrison. The Martha on screen continued, detailing the jewelry incident, her son Richard's confession, her shame at cutting off my family based on lies. Then came the damning part. I've watched my children and grandchildren for years now. They're vultures, every one of them. They've stolen from me, lied to me, threatened me when I wouldn't give them more money. Richard embezzled from the family company. Caroline has been married 4 times, each time taking the man for everything he had. And Melissa. Martha's face hardened. Melissa is the worst of them all. A predator who uses marriage as a weapon. The plaintiff's attorney, a slick man named David Brennan, tried to object, but Judge Thornton allowed the video to continue. Martha went on to explain how she'd hired investigators, learned about my life, my integrity, my struggles as a single mother. Daisy never knew I was watching. She never asked for anything, never tried to contact me for money even when I knew she was working 3 jobs. She has something my family lacks, character. Next came the medical evidence. Dr. Crawford testified that Martha had been in excellent mental health until her death. She was sharp as a tack, he said firmly. Played chess every week, managed her investment portfolio herself, and beat me at poker regularly. Any suggestion of diminished capacity is absolute nonsense. The forensic accountant presented evidence of the Harrison family's financial crimes. Richard had indeed embezzled over $2 million from the company over 15 years. Caroline had a pattern of marrying wealthy older men who died under suspicious circumstances, though nothing had ever been proven. Various cousins had taken loans they never repaid, stolen valuables, and in one case, tried to have Martha declared incompetent to gain control of her assets. But the most shocking revelations came from the private investigator, Marcus Chen. He'd uncovered Melissa's past in devastating detail. 2 previous marriages, both to men with wealthy families, both ending when the money ran out. The second husband, James Fitzgerald, had provided a sworn affidavit. Melissa targeted me specifically because my grandmother had money, James's statement read. She researched my family, learned our routines, orchestrated our meeting. After we married, she systematically isolated me from my family while secretly maintaining contact with them. When my grandmother discovered what was happening and changed her will, Melissa left me within a week. I later learned she was already pursuing her next target. The next target had been Brian. Chen presented evidence that Melissa had paid for background checks on several men, all with wealthy elderly relatives, before settling on my son. She'd known about the family connection to Martha, known I was listed as a contingency beneficiary in an older will, and gambled that getting close to me would eventually pay off. This is character assassination. Brennan objected. My client's past relationships have no bearing on Martha Harrison's mental state. On the contrary, Charles responded. They demonstrate exactly why Mrs. Harrison chose to leave her estate to Mrs. Morrison. She knew what her family was capable of and took steps to protect her assets from further predation. The bombshell came when Charles presented evidence that Melissa wasn't even legally divorced from her second husband when she married Brian. The divorce was never finalized. Melissa Harrison Williams Morrison is guilty of bigamy, which means her marriage to Brian Morrison is void. The courtroom erupted. Melissa jumped to her feet, screaming denials. Brian looked like he'd been punched in the gut. Richard and Caroline tried to rush the plaintiff's table, held back by bailiffs. Judge Thornton banged her gavel repeatedly, threatening to clear the courtroom. When order was restored, Brennan tried desperately to salvage his case. He brought character witnesses who painted me as cold and calculating, but they were all people who barely knew me, clearly coached and compensated. He tried to suggest the video depositions were coerced, but the presence of multiple witnesses and Martha's obvious lucidity undermined that claim. The turning point came when Brian asked to testify. Against his lawyer's advice and definitely against Melissa's shrieking objections, he took the stand. Melissa told me she loved me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She said her family was difficult, that they'd cut her off unfairly. I believed her. But after Mom inherited from Martha, Melissa changed completely. She told me I was an idiot, that I'd served my purpose. She said once she contested the will and got her money, she'd make sure I never saw our children again. Objection. Brennan shouted. Hearsay. It's not hearsay if I have the recording, Brian said quietly, pulling out his phone. I started recording our conversations after I found out about the bigamy. Melissa's voice filled the courtroom, cruel and mocking. Did you really think I loved you? You're nothing but a means to an end. Your mother stole what belongs to my family, and I'm going to get it back. Once I do, you'll be lucky if you see your son once a year. And this baby? You'll never even meet her. Judge Thornton had heard enough. After a brief recess, she returned with her decision. The evidence presented clearly demonstrates that Martha Harrison was of sound mind when she executed her will. Furthermore, the behavior of the plaintiffs both before and after her death validates her decision to disinherit them. The will stands as written. All assets transfer to Daisy Morrison. She wasn't done. Additionally, based on evidence presented today, I'm referring the matter of Melissa Harrison's bigamy to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. Mr. Morrison, I strongly suggest you petition for emergency custody of your son immediately, as his mother may soon be facing jail time. The Harrison family exploded in rage, screaming threats as they were escorted from the courtroom. Richard had to be physically restrained from lunging at me. Caroline spat in my direction, her carefully constructed society facade completely shattered. But it was Melissa's face I'd remember forever, twisted with such hatred it barely looked human. Outside the courthouse, Charles shook my hand warmly. Congratulations, Daisy. It's over. The estate is yours, free and clear. But I knew better. The legal battle might be over, but with people like this, the war was just beginning. Still, I'd won the first crucial victory. Martha's wishes had been honored, and more importantly, the truth about the Harrison family had been exposed for all to see. Brian approached hesitantly as the crowd dispersed. Mom, I'm so sorry. For everything. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want you to know I'm going to fight for my son. Melissa won't win this time. I studied my son, seeing new lines on his face, a hardness that hadn't been there before. Maybe this painful experience would finally help him grow a spine. Get your son, Brian. Get him away from that woman. Then we'll talk about forgiveness. The aftermath of the court decision unleashed a fury I couldn't have anticipated. Within 24 hours, Melissa had launched a scorched earth campaign that made her family's previous attacks look like gentle warnings. She might have lost the inheritance battle, but she was determined to destroy everything else in her wake. It started with social media. Melissa, despite being 7 months pregnant, spent hours crafting posts that painted me as a monster who'd torn apart a loving family for money. She posted old photos from happier times, carefully curated to show her as the devoted wife and mother, with captions like, "This woman chose money over her own grandchild," and, "Imagine being so heartless you'd destroy your son's marriage for an inheritance." The posts went viral in our community. People who'd known me for years suddenly looked at me differently. At the grocery store, conversations stopped when I passed. Former colleagues from the school crossed the street to avoid me. Even though the embezzlement charges had been dropped as baseless, the damage to my reputation lingered like poison. But Melissa's cruelest weapon was baby James. She filed an emergency motion claiming I posed a danger to the child, citing the family violence of the inheritance dispute. Despite having no evidence, she managed to get a temporary order preventing me from any contact with my grandson. Brian, still reeling from the bigamy revelation and struggling to establish his rights as a father, couldn't override it immediately. "She's claiming I'm unstable," Brian told me during one of our strained phone conversations. "Says the stress of discovering her past has made me erratic and dangerous. She has her mother backing her up, sworn statements from their friends saying I've been aggressive and threatening." "Have you?" I asked, though I knew my son better than that. "Of course not. But she's been recording me, goading me into arguments and then editing them to make me look unhinged." "Mom, I don't know how to fight someone this calculating." The situation with Helen, my own sister, proved equally painful. She'd initially sided with me, offering support and sympathy. But as weeks passed and I didn't immediately shower her with money, her attitude shifted. The final break came when I discovered she'd been feeding information to Caroline Harrison. "They offered me $50,000, Helen admitted when I confronted her. "Just to tell them about your habits, your weaknesses. Daisy, I have bills. My kids need things. You have millions now, and you haven't offered to help at all." "You betrayed me for money?" I couldn't hide my disgust. "You betrayed me first," she shot back. "All that money and you can't help your own sister? You're just as selfish as they said you were." The irony wasn't lost on me. The fortune that was supposed to solve problems had instead revealed the true character of everyone around me. Even some of Brian's childhood friends reached out, suddenly remembering our close connection, and wondering if I might invest in their various business ventures. But Melissa wasn't done. She escalated her attacks by targeting my professional life beyond the false embezzlement claims. She contacted the American Library Association with complaints about my moral character, suggesting someone who would destroy a family for money shouldn't be working with children. She filed complaints with every educational board she could find, posted reviews on school rating sites warning parents about me. The school board, already nervous about the controversy, suggested I consider early retirement. "It's not that we believe any of it," the superintendent assured me, "but the negative attention is disruptive. Perhaps it would be best for everyone if you stepped away quietly." 23 years of dedication reduced to a liability because of lies and manipulation. I agreed to retire, another victory for Melissa's campaign of destruction. The custody battle between Brian and Melissa turned even uglier. Despite the bigamy issue, which should have given Brian clear advantage, Melissa's pregnancy complicated matters. She claimed the stress of Brian's harassment was endangering her unborn child. She produced medical records showing elevated blood pressure, though Charles's investigator discovered she'd been taking caffeine pills before each doctor's visit to manipulate the readings. "She's trying to establish a pattern," Brian's custody lawyer explained. "If she can paint Brian as a danger to her pregnancy, it strengthens her position for both children. The fact that their marriage is void actually works in her favor. She can claim she's a vulnerable single mother being persecuted by a bitter ex." Then came the anonymous letters. Someone, likely hired by Richard despite his bail conditions, began a whisper campaign in my hometown. Letters arrived at neighbors' houses, local businesses, even my church, filled with lies about my past. They claimed I'd been a negligent mother, that I'd had affairs with married men, that I'd manipulated lonely elderly people at the library for years. Most people dismissed them, but doubt lingered like smoke damage after a fire. The pastor gently suggested I might be happier at a different church, until things settled down. The book club I'd belonged to for 15 years suddenly had no room for me. The community garden where I'd volunteered voted to revoke my plot, citing concerns about the organization's reputation. Caroline Harrison, meanwhile, worked her society connections. Suddenly, every charity I'd supported received calls questioning my donations. Was the money really mine? Had it been obtained illegally? Museums removed my name from donor lists. The animal shelter where I'd volunteered for a decade asked me to step back, temporarily. Through all of this, Martha's house in Asheville stood empty, waiting. I'd been too overwhelmed to move there, clinging to the familiar even as it turned hostile. But when someone threw a brick through my apartment window with "thief" painted on it, I knew it was time. They want you to run, Charles advised. Don't give them the satisfaction. Move to Asheville, yes, but do it on your terms. Make it clear you're not being driven out, you're moving up. The move itself became another battlefield. Melissa somehow discovered the date and showed up at my apartment building with a photographer, staging a scene where she appeared to be begging for reconciliation while I, coldly, ignored her. The photos appeared online within hours, heavily pregnant woman rebuffed by heartless mother-in-law. But the worst betrayal came from an unexpected source. Sheila Garrett, my best friend of 30 years, the one person I'd thought would stand by me through anything, published an article in the local paper. The Daisy I knew, a friend's perspective, detailed every confidence I'd ever shared, every moment of weakness, spun to support the narrative that I was calculating and cold. They offered me a book deal, Sheila explained when I called her, devastated. My memoir about our friendship, about knowing someone who could do something like this. I need the money, Daisy. Jim's medical bills are crushing us. I would have helped you, I said quietly. Would you? You've had millions for 2 months and never offered. You've become someone I don't recognize. The truth was, I'd been planning to help, had already discussed setting up a medical fund with Charles. But I'd wanted to be careful, to do things properly. Now it was too late. Another friendship sacrificed on the altar of money I'd never asked for. As I supervised the movers at my apartment, my phone rang. Brian, panic in his voice. Mom, Melissa's in labor. Something's wrong. They're doing an emergency C-section. Despite everything, my heart clenched. An innocent baby caught in this toxic mess. Keep me informed, I said, though we both knew I wouldn't be allowed anywhere near the hospital. Hours later, he called back. It's a girl. She's healthy. Melissa is fine too. He paused. She's already filed paperwork naming the baby Martha, says it's to honor her great-grandmother's memory. Mom, she's trying to stake a claim through the baby's name. Even in childbirth, Melissa was scheming. She'd named her daughter after the woman whose will she'd contested, creating a narrative where the baby was the rightful heir, denied her inheritance. It was brilliant in its manipulation, and I felt a chill recognizing just how dangerous my grandson's mother truly was. That night, in a hotel room between my old life and new, I sat with Charles's investigators' final report. The full scope of the Harrison family's web of destruction spread across decades, dozens of victims left financially and emotionally ruined. And I'd become their latest target, but unlike the others, I had resources to fight back. They made one mistake, Charles had said earlier. They went after someone with Martha's money and Martha's determination. She chose you because she knew you'd fight. Don't let her down. Looking out at the city lights, I made my decision. No more defense. No more letting them control the narrative. It was time to show the Harrison family what happened when they targeted the wrong grandmother. The betrayal had cut deep, but it had also freed me from any obligation to play nice. If they wanted war, they'd get it. 3 months into my new life in Asheville, I finally stopped playing defense. The Harrison family had expected me to crumble under their assault, to either capitulate or retreat into hiding. They'd gravely miscalculated. With Martha's resources at my disposal and a burning desire for justice, I began my carefully orchestrated counteroffensive. It started with hiring the best. Marcus Chen, the private investigator who'd uncovered Melissa's bigamy, now worked exclusively for me. His team dug deeper into the Harrison family history, and what they found was a goldmine of corruption spanning generations. Sarah Winters, a crisis management specialist who'd handled scandals for Fortune 500 companies, took charge of rehabilitating my reputation. And Jennifer Marks, Charles's associate, began building criminal cases against every Harrison family member who'd broken the law. We go after them systematically, I told my team during our first strategy meeting in Martha's study, a room lined with books and photos of better times. Not for revenge, but for justice. Every person they've hurt, every crime they've committed, everything comes to light. The first blow came when Marcus uncovered Melissa's real first marriage, the one she'd hidden from everyone. At 18, she'd married an elderly man named Walter Crenshaw in Vegas. He'd died 6 months later under suspicious circumstances, leaving her a small fortune she'd burned through by 21. His children had always suspected foul play but could never prove it. Now, with proper resources, we found the nurse who'd been on duty that night, ready to talk after years of guilt. While Jennifer worked with prosecutors on that angle, Sarah began placing strategic media stories. Not about me, but about the victims. The employees Richard had fired to cover his embezzlement. The investors Caroline had ruined with fraudulent schemes. The elderly men Melissa had targeted over the years. Real people with real stories, creating a pattern too clear to ignore. But the masterstroke came from studying Melissa's own playbook. She'd used social media to destroy my reputation, so I used it to restore it. We created the Morrison Foundation for Elder Protection, dedicated to helping seniors protect themselves from financial predators. The first major donation? $1 million to establish a legal aid fund for victims of inheritance fraud. "You're giving away Martha's money?" Brian asked during one of his visits. He was living in a small apartment now, fighting for custody while working 2 jobs to pay legal bills. "I'm investing it in justice," I corrected. "And building something Martha would be proud of." The foundation's launch event drew media attention for all the right reasons. I spoke simply and honestly about my experience, about Martha's wish to protect others from predatory relatives. We streamed it live, and within hours, dozens of seniors contacted us with similar stories. The Harrison family wasn't unique in their greed, just particularly brazen. Meanwhile, Marcus's team had found Melissa's second husband, James Fitzgerald, living quietly in Maine. He'd been too traumatized to speak publicly before, but with our legal team's protection, he agreed to a tell-all interview with a national magazine. His story of emotional manipulation, financial abuse, and systematic isolation painted a chilling picture of Melissa's methods. The bigamy charge moved forward quickly once prosecutors had all the evidence. Melissa, despite having just given birth, faced serious jail time. Her family hired the best lawyers money could buy, but the paper trail was undeniable. She'd never officially divorced Walter Crenshaw before marrying James, and she'd never divorced James before marrying Brian. 3 marriages, 0 legal divorces. Caroline tried to salvage the situation with a PR offensive of her own, but Sarah was always 2 steps ahead. Every sympathetic interview Caroline gave was followed by testimonials from her victims. Every accusation against me was countered with documented evidence of Harrison family crimes. The court of public opinion began to shift. The real breakthrough came when one of Martha's former household staff reached out. Gladys Tompkins had worked for Martha for 30 years before being fired by Richard 5 years ago. She had recordings, dozens of them, made to protect herself after witnessing Richard threaten other employees. The recordings were devastating. Richard discussing how to embezzle without detection. Caroline planning to have Martha declared incompetent. Melissa, visiting her great-grandmother, saying, "Once the old bat dies, we'll contest any will that doesn't give us everything." And Martha herself, sharp and clear, saying she'd rather burn the money than let her parasitic family have another cent. We turned everything over to the authorities. Federal investigators, already interested because of the embezzlement crossing state lines, launched a comprehensive probe. The IRS began forensic audits. Adult Protective Services opened cases on several elderly victims. What had started as a family dispute became a multi-agency criminal investigation. Melissa made a fatal error trying to use baby Martha as leverage. She filed for emergency support, claiming poverty while living in her parents' mansion. But our forensic accountants found the hidden accounts, money stolen from her previous husband squirreled away in offshore havens. The judge not only denied her support request but ordered her assets frozen pending investigation. "She's getting desperate," Brian warned me. "She cornered me at the custody exchange, said if you don't back off, she'll make sure I never see either child again." "She's already doing that," I pointed out. He'd seen James exactly 3 times since the divorce filing, always supervised, always contentious. The foundation, meanwhile, flourished beyond my wildest dreams. Seniors from across the country shared their stories, donated what they could, volunteered their time. We funded legal battles against predatory relatives, provided counseling for victims, created educational programs about financial elder abuse. Martha's money, intended for good, finally served its purpose. Local opinion shifted dramatically when the foundation opened a Asheville office offering free legal consultations for seniors. My former colleagues from the library reached out, apologizing for believing the lies. The church invited me back. The book club had an opening after all. But I politely declined most overtures. I'd learned who my real friends were when times got tough. The criminal charges mounted. Richard was arrested for embezzlement, conspiracy, and witness intimidation. Caroline faced fraud charges in 3 states. Various cousins scrambled for plea deals, turning on each other spectacularly. And Melissa, the mastermind of marrying for money, faced not just bigamy charges but potential murder charges in Walter Crenshaw's death. "How does it feel?" Charles asked during one of our meetings. "Watching them all fall?" "Empty," I admitted honestly. "None of this brings back the relationships they destroyed. But maybe it prevents them from hurting anyone else." The custody battle turned in Brian's favor as Melissa's crimes piled up. No judge would leave children with a woman facing potential life in prison. Brian got emergency custody of both children while Melissa awaited trial. The first time he brought them to Martha's house, baby James now 14 months old and baby Martha just 3 months, I wept. Gamma. James reached for me, and I realized Melissa had been telling him I was dead. But children remember love, and he knew my voice, my smell, the lullabies I'd sung in his first days of life. The foundation's first major victory came when we helped an elderly man in Texas recover his home from a grandson who'd forged documents. Then a woman in Florida got justice against a daughter who'd drained her accounts. Each success brought more attention, more donations, more volunteers. Martha's legacy grew beyond anything she could have imagined. Melissa's trial began 6 months after my counteroffensive started. By then, her family empire had crumbled. Richard was serving 5 to 10 for embezzlement. Caroline had fled the country to avoid prosecution. Lesser relatives had pled guilty to various charges, turning state's evidence to reduce sentences. Sitting in that courtroom, watching Melissa in an orange jumpsuit instead of designer clothes, I felt no satisfaction. She'd created her own downfall through greed and cruelty. All I'd done was shine a light on the truth. The prosecutor asked if I wanted to give a victim impact statement. I declined. My impact would be the foundation, the lives saved, the predators stopped. That was the only statement that mattered. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. As they led Melissa away, she turned to look at me one last time. The hatred in her eyes had dimmed to something else, perhaps recognition that she'd chosen the wrong mark. I held her gaze steadily until she disappeared through the doors. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. But I didn't speak to them. Instead, I went to pick up my grandchildren from Brian's apartment. We had a lot of lost time to make up, and thanks to Martha's gift and my determination to fight, we now had the chance. 6 months after Melissa's conviction, Martha's mansion had transformed into something beautiful. What once stood as a monument to family dysfunction now hummed with life and purpose. The Morrison Foundation for Elder Protection occupied the main floor, while the upper levels served as a community center for seniors and families affected by financial abuse. I stood in the garden Martha had loved, watching my grandchildren play on the new playground equipment. James, now 20 months old, toddled after butterflies while baby Martha, 9 months, gurgled happily in her bouncer. Brian sat nearby, looking healthier than he had in years, finally free from the toxic weight of his marriage to Melissa. The contractors finished the library wing, Sarah Winters informed me, approaching with her usual efficient smile. We can host the first support group meeting next week. The support groups had been my idea, born from my own isolation during the worst of the attacks. Victims of family financial abuse often suffered in silence, ashamed of being targeted by their own relatives. Here, they could share their stories, find legal help, and realize they weren't alone. "Mom, James is eating dirt again," Brian called out, rushing to extract mulch from his son's mouth. I laughed, remembering Brian at that age, equally determined to taste everything in reach. These simple moments of normal family life felt miraculous after everything we'd endured. Melissa had tried to steal this from us, and she'd nearly succeeded. The foundation's success exceeded all projections. In just 6 months, we'd helped recover over $12 million for elderly victims, funded 23 legal battles against predatory relatives, and established educational programs in 17 states. Martha's money, multiplied by donations from grateful families and concerned citizens, created a movement. "Mrs. Morrison?" A hesitant voice drew my attention. A woman in her 70s stood at the garden gate, clutching a folder. "I'm Dorothy Chen. You helped my father recover his savings from my brother. I wanted to thank you in person." These visits happened regularly now. People whose lives we'd touched coming to share their gratitude, their stories, their own desires to help others. Dorothy's father had been scammed out of his retirement by a son with gambling debts. Our legal team had recovered most of it and seen the son prosecuted. "How is your father?" I asked, inviting her in. "Thriving. He's volunteering with your foundation now, teaching other seniors about financial safety. He says you gave him purpose again, not just his money back." That evening, Brian and I sat on the porch after putting the children to bed. The mountains stretched before us, painted gold by the setting sun. It was peaceful in a way my life hadn't been for almost 2 years. "I've been thinking about James and Martha's future," Brian said quietly. "About what to tell them about their mother when they're older." It was a conversation we'd both dreaded. Melissa had signed away parental rights as part of a plea deal that reduced her sentence to 15 years. She'd be eligible for parole in 7, but would never have custody again. "How do you explain that to children?" "We tell them the truth," I said finally. "Age appropriately, but honestly. Their mother made terrible choices that hurt people. But they aren't responsible for her actions. They're free to become whoever they want to be." Brian nodded slowly. "I want them to know about Aunt Martha too. The real her, not the bitter woman her family created. The one who saw through the greed and chose to do something meaningful with her wealth." The foundation had recently expanded beyond elder protection. We now offered scholarships for students pursuing careers in elder law and social work. We funded investigative journalism exposing financial crimes against seniors. We even lobbied for stronger laws protecting vulnerable adults from family exploitation. Charles Wellington, still managing the legal aspects of Martha's estate, visited monthly with updates. "The Harrison family appeals have all been denied," he reported during his latest visit. And Richard's attempt to sue the foundation from prison was dismissed with prejudice. "I think they've finally accepted defeat." But defeat was the wrong word for what had happened to them. They'd simply faced consequences for the first time in their lives. Richard would serve at least 8 more years. Caroline remained in exile, her assets frozen, living off the charity of distant relatives who'd soon tire of her. The various cousins who'd participated in the schemes struggled with criminal records that prevented them from continuing their predatory practices. Helen, my sister, had reached out recently through a mutual friend. She wanted to apologize, to reconcile, claiming she'd been desperate and made a terrible mistake. I'd sent her a check for her children's education, but made it clear our relationship was over. Some betrayals cut too deep for simple forgiveness. "Mrs. Morrison?" Marcus Chen appeared in the doorway, still my head of security though the threats had largely ended. "There's someone here to see you. Says she's from the state foster system?" My heart sank. Had something happened with the custody arrangement? But the woman who entered carried good news instead. We've been following your foundation's work, she explained. We'd like to propose a partnership. Many foster children age out with no family support, making them vulnerable to financial predators. Your programs could save lives. Another expansion, another way to honor Martha's legacy. I agreed to explore the partnership, knowing Martha would have loved protecting young people from the kind of family she'd been cursed with. As the months passed, the foundation grew into a nationally recognized force for good. We opened chapters in 12 states, each staffed by locals who understood their community's needs. The Morrison Foundation became synonymous with justice for elder abuse victims, and I received invitations to speak at conferences, universities, and congressional hearings on elder protection. But the real victory sat in my lap that Christmas morning, as James tore through wrapping paper with toddler enthusiasm while Martha gnawed on a toy. Brian had met someone new, a pediatric nurse named Grace who understood his complicated past and loved his children unconditionally. She joined us for dinner, fitting seamlessly into our rebuilt family. To Martha Harrison, Brian raised his glass during our toast. Who saw clearly when others were blinded by greed. To Martha, I echoed, thinking of the woman who'd given me more than money. She'd given me purpose, the ability to transform personal pain into public good. The foundation received a special visitor that spring. James Fitzgerald, Melissa's second husband, came to volunteer. You saved me from thinking I was crazy, he said simply. She made me doubt my own reality. Now I want to help others trapped in similar situations. He became one of our most effective counselors, his gentle manner and personal experience helping male victims who often struggled to admit they'd been financially abused by female partners. His story, once a source of shame, became a beacon of hope for others. One quiet evening, I found myself in Martha's study, now my office. Her portrait hung on the wall, those sharp eyes seeming to watch approvingly. On my desk sat letters from hundreds of people whose lives we'd touched. Seniors who'd recovered their independence. Adult children who'd learned to protect their parents. Families who'd found justice against their predators. You did this, I told Martha's portrait. Your choice to trust me with your legacy created all of this good. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Brian peered in, carrying a sleepy James. Someone wanted to say good night to Grandma. Night-night, Gamma, James mumbled, reaching for me. Love you too, sweetheart, I whispered, holding him close. As I rocked my grandson, I thought about the journey that brought us here. Melissa's cruelty had seemed like the end of everything. That morning she banished me from her living room. Instead, it became the beginning of something larger than any of us. The Harrison family's greed had ultimately defeated itself, their desperate grasping for wealth destroying what little they'd had. But Martha's generosity, channeled through the foundation, multiplied exponentially. Every dollar spent protecting vulnerable seniors, every predator stopped, every family reunited, added to a legacy of love triumphing over greed. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's building something so beautiful from the ashes of cruelty that the original harm becomes irrelevant. Martha knew that. She'd chosen me not for revenge against her family, but for redemption, for the chance to transform wealth hoarded through selfishness into a force for justice. As I tucked James into his bed in the room that had once been Melissa's childhood sanctuary, I felt the cycle breaking. These children would grow up surrounded by love, not manipulation. They'd learn generosity, not greed. They'd understand that family meant protecting each other, not preying on weakness. The man in the suit who'd changed everything that morning turned out to be more than Martha's lawyer. He'd been the messenger of Martha's final act of love, her determination that good would come from a lifetime of family dysfunction. And it had, in ways none of us could have imagined. Looking back, would I change anything? Would I prefer Melissa had been genuine, that Brian had been stronger, that the money had never entered our lives? Perhaps. But then I thought of Dorothy Chen's father, teaching financial literacy with newfound purpose. James Fitzgerald, counseling abuse victims with hard-won wisdom. The thousands of seniors who'd found justice through our foundation. Pain had become purpose. Betrayal had become blessing. And a grandmother's rejection from a living room had led to building a house where all were welcome, all were protected, and love actually meant something. Martha's true inheritance wasn't money. It was the chance to transform grief into grace, to build from betrayal a beacon of hope. And with my grandchildren sleeping safely under this roof, with Brian healing and helping others, with the foundation growing stronger each day, I knew we'd honored that inheritance in the best way possible. The Harrison family had thought they were entitled to Martha's money. But Martha knew better. She knew real wealth wasn't what you took but what you gave, not what you hoarded but what you shared, not who you destroyed but who you lifted up. And so, in the end, the man in the suit hadn't just changed my life that morning. Through Martha's vision and our foundation's work, he'd changed thousands of lives. And we were just getting started. What would you do if faced with family betrayal over money? Have you seen how greed can destroy relationships meant to be sacred? Share your thoughts below, and remember, true wealth lies not in what we possess but in how we use our blessings to bless others. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe to hear more stories of triumph over adversity. Share this with someone who needs to remember that even the darkest betrayals can lead to the brightest new beginnings. Thank you for joining Daisy's journey, and may you always choose love over greed, justice over revenge, and purpose over pain.